For 20 years, I lived believing my marriage was built on trust, loyalty, and safety. What I didn't know was that one night, one single night, had been sold behind my back. My friend, with trembling hands and shame in his eyes, finally told me the truth. My husband had sold a night with me for $5,000. He treated me like a bargain, a transaction, a secret he thought would never surface. And yet, when the truth emerged, something unexpected awakened inside me. I remembered that night, the tension, the fire, the sudden surge of confidence I couldn't understand at the time. Back then, I didn't know what had happened behind the scenes. I only remembered feeling something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't humiliation, it was power. A power I never knew I had. While my husband believed the truth would destroy me, it did the opposite. Instead of breaking, I grew stronger. Instead of crying, I understood. Instead of hating myself, I realized something deeper about who I was, about the part of me that had been asleep for decades. So when the truth unfolded after 20 long years, my reaction wasn't what anyone expected, especially not my husband, because that night didn't hurt me. It awakened a version of myself I had forgotten. And now, for the first time in my life, I wanted more. Not out of revenge, not out of anger, but out of the discovery of who I truly was. From that moment on, the rules of our marriage changed forever. If you want to know how this shocking revelation transformed my life and changed everything I thought I knew about myself, hit that like button and subscribe now. Drop a comment sharing what awakening you've had in your own life. This story will leave you breathless. Let's begin. My name is Isabel, and I need to tell you about the night that happened 20 years ago, the night I didn't understand until recently, and how learning the truth about it changed absolutely everything about who I thought I was and what I thought my marriage had been. This isn't a story about victimhood or betrayal in the way you might expect. This is something more complicated, more uncomfortable, and ultimately more transformative than I could have imagined when my friend Marcus finally told me what my husband had done. I was 28 when I married Adrian. He was 35, successful in commercial real estate, confident and commanding in a way that made me feel protected and desired. I'd been working as a marketing coordinator at a tech startup, ambitious but still finding my footing professionally. Adrian swept into my life like a force of nature, pursuing me with intensity that felt flattering and overwhelming. We married after a year of dating in a wedding that his wealth and taste made elegant and impressive. The early years of our marriage were good in conventional ways. Adrian provided well financially. We bought a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood. We traveled to exotic locations and attended high society events where I learned to navigate conversations with people far wealthier and more established than my middle-class upbringing had prepared me for. I played the role of the successful man's beautiful wife, supporting Adrian's career in social climbing while my own professional ambitions slowly faded into background noise. Adrian had always been controlling in subtle ways I'd initially interpreted as protectiveness. He had strong opinions about what I wore, who I spent time with, how I presented myself in public. He'd critique my choices gently but persistently until I started automatically deferring to his preferences. He managed our finances entirely, giving me an allowance for personal expenses but maintaining complete control over our accounts and investments. He made all major decisions about our life, from where we lived to how we spent holidays to whether we'd have children, which he'd decided we wouldn't, without really consulting me. But I'd accepted all of this as normal for a traditional marriage where the husband was the primary earner and decision-maker. My mother had lived similarly with my father. Adrian's control felt like leadership rather than domination. At least, that's what I told myself. I was comfortable even if I wasn't entirely happy, secure even if I felt increasingly invisible as an individual separate from my role as Adrian's wife. The night in question happened during our 8th year of marriage. Adrian had invited his business partner Marcus and several other colleagues to our home for dinner and drinks. It was the kind of evening we hosted regularly, me playing the gracious hostess while the men discussed deals and strategies. I'd gotten good at this performance, knowing exactly how to dress and behave to reflect well on Adrian without drawing too much attention to myself. But that particular evening felt different from the moment it started. Adrian was unusually attentive to me, complimenting my appearance repeatedly, touching me more than he typically did in front of others. keeping me close to his side throughout the evening. The attention felt strange because our marriage had become relatively passionless by that point, intimate more out of routine than desire. His sudden focus on me was flattering, but also confusing. As the evening progressed and alcohol flowed freely, the energy in the room shifted into something charged and slightly dangerous. The conversations became more risque, the jokes more sexual. Adrian kept refilling my wine glass and encouraging me to relax and enjoy myself. I felt increasingly uninhibited in ways I normally wouldn't, performing a version of myself that was bolder and more confident than my usual reserved personality. Marcus, in particular, seemed focused on me that night. He'd always been polite and professional during previous encounters, but that evening he was flirtatious and intense, holding eye contact longer than appropriate, complimenting me in ways that felt deliberately provocative. Adrian didn't seem bothered by this attention. In fact, he seemed to encourage it, making jokes about Marcus appreciating beautiful women and suggesting I should feel flattered by his interest. At some point, late in the evening, after the other guests had left, it was just Adrian, Marcus, and me. The energy became even more electric. I remember feeling desired in a way I hadn't experienced in years, not just by Marcus but reflected in how Adrian was looking at me too, like he was seeing me as desirable rather than just familiar. There was tension and possibility hanging in the air that I couldn't quite name but that made my pulse race. What happened next is something I remembered in fragments for 20 years, without fully understanding the context. The three of us ended up in our bedroom. There was touching and kissing and exploration that involved all three of us in various combinations. I remembered feeling powerful and desired and alive in ways I'd forgotten I could feel. I remembered Adrian watching me with Marcus, encouraging me, directing the encounter in ways that amplified my pleasure and confidence. I remembered the intensity of sensation and connection, the feeling of being fully present in my body and desires for the first time in years. The next morning, I woke up confused and slightly ashamed, unsure how to process what had happened. Adrian acted completely normal, making breakfast and discussing mundane weekend plans like nothing unusual had occurred. When I tentatively brought up the previous night, he brushed it off casually, saying we'd all had too much to drink and things had gotten a bit wild. But it was no big deal, just adults having fun. He suggested we not overthink it or make it weird, that it could just be a fun memory we didn't need to analyze. So I followed his lead and pushed the experience into a compartment in my mind labeled as a one-time drunken mistake that didn't mean anything. Marcus was still occasionally around for business dinners, but we never acknowledged what had happened and fell back into polite professional interaction. Life continued as normal. Years passed. I convinced myself I'd imagined the intensity of that night, or at least that it had been a meaningless aberration in an otherwise conventional marriage. But something had shifted in me after that night, something I couldn't quite articulate. I felt different in my body, more aware of myself as a sexual being separate from my role as Adrian's wife. I felt a restlessness that hadn't been there before, a sense that there were parts of myself I'd locked away or never explored. I pushed these feelings down because they didn't fit the life I was living and because I didn't know what to do with them, but they never entirely disappeared. 20 years passed. I was 48 years old, still married to Adrian, still living the comfortable suburban life we'd built. Our marriage had become more distant over the decades, more about routine and logistics than connection or passion. Adrian traveled frequently for work. I'd returned to working part-time in marketing consulting. We were friendly roommates more than romantic partners, which seemed normal for a marriage approaching its third decade. Then Marcus called me asking if we could meet for coffee. He'd left Adrian's company years earlier and we'd had minimal contact since. His request was unusual enough that I agreed out of curiosity. We met at a cafe far from my neighborhood, and from the moment he sat down, I could see he was troubled and nervous in ways I'd never seen in the confident businessman I'd known. Marcus said he needed to tell me something that had been weighing on him for 20 years, something he'd kept secret out of loyalty to Adrian, but that he could no longer in good conscience hide. He said his conscience had been eating at him, especially after his own recent divorce, after his ex-wife had confessed to infidelities that made him reevaluate his own past behaviors and secrets. He said he owed me the truth, even though it would likely destroy my marriage and possibly our friendship. Then he told me about that night 20 years ago. He said it hadn't been a spontaneous, drunken accident. Adrian had propositioned him weeks earlier, had offered him $5,000 to sleep with me while Adrian watched. Marcus had been shocked and initially refused, but Adrian had been persistent, explaining that it was a fantasy he wanted to fulfill, that I would never know about the financial arrangement, that it would be a secret between them. Adrian had assured Marcus that I would be willing once the evening was appropriately orchestrated, that I just needed the right circumstances to feel comfortable exploring that kind of encounter. Marcus said he'd eventually agreed, partly for the money, but also out of curiosity and attraction to me, and because Adrian's confidence had made it seem acceptable somehow. He said the entire evening had been staged, from Adrian's unusual attentiveness to me to the timing of other guests leaving to the progression into the bedroom. Adrian had orchestrated everything to create the conditions where I'd feel uninhibited enough to participate while having no idea that the encounter had been purchased and planned. I sat there completely frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. My husband had sold a night with me for $5,000. He'd pimped me out to his business partner under the guise of a spontaneous threesome. He'd commodified my body and sexuality without my knowledge or consent. He'd violated my autonomy in fundamental ways, while making me believe I was a willing participant in something we were all choosing together. Marcus was crying as he told me this, saying he'd felt guilty for 20 years but had convinced himself it wasn't his place to tell me, that what I didn't know couldn't hurt me, that Adrian had probably been right that I'd enjoyed the experience, so maybe the deception didn't really matter. But his recent divorce and confrontation with his own wife's lies had made him realize that consent obtained through manipulation and hidden financial transactions wasn't real consent, that what Adrian had done was a profound betrayal regardless of whether I'd enjoyed the physical experience. He said he was sorry, that he'd been wrong to participate, that he should have told me immediately afterward, but had been too much of a coward. He said he understood if I hated him and never wanted to see him again, but he couldn't carry the secret anymore, couldn't let me continue living in ignorance of something so fundamental about my marriage and about a defining moment in my own sexual history. I left that cafe in a daze, drove home on autopilot, sat in my car in the driveway for over an hour trying to process everything. My mind kept returning to that night 20 years ago, recontextualizing every moment with this new information. The way Adrian had stage-managed the evening, the unusual attentiveness and encouragement, the way he'd watched and directed the encounter. None of it had been spontaneous or organic. It had all been purchased and planned, a sexual transaction where I was the commodity being sold without my knowledge. I should have felt violated and devastated. I should have been furious and broken. And part of me was, genuinely. Adrian had betrayed my trust in ways that seemed unforgivable. He'd treated me like property he could sell for entertainment and profit. He'd robbed me of the ability to consent meaningfully to that sexual experience. But there was something else too, something I didn't expect and struggled to understand. That night had awakened something in me, something that had remained dormant in the 20 years since. The memory of feeling desired and powerful and alive in my sexuality, the experience of being the center of male attention and desire, the physical pleasure and emotional intensity of that encounter. Those things had been real even if the context had been a lie. I'd touched something authentic in myself that night, even though the circumstances were manufactured and manipulative. When Adrian came home that evening, I confronted him immediately. I told him Marcus had revealed everything about the $5,000 and the arrangement and the way that entire night had been orchestrated. Adrian's face went through several emotions rapidly: shock, fear, anger, calculation. He tried denying it initially, saying Marcus was lying or misremembering. When I pressed with specific details only Marcus could have known, Adrian shifted to minimizing, saying it had been a long time ago and didn't really matter now. I asked him how he could justify selling a night with his wife for money. He said I was being dramatic, that he hadn't sold me, that he'd arranged an experience he thought we'd both enjoy, and that Marcus helping facilitate that experience had been compensated. He said I'd clearly enjoyed it based on my participation and response. So what did it matter how the encounter had been arranged? He said I was retroactively withdrawing consent because I was upset about details that didn't change the fundamental reality of what had happened. His rationalizations were nauseating, but also revealing. Adrian genuinely didn't understand why I was upset. To him, my enjoyment of the experience justified the deception and commodification. He couldn't or wouldn't see that consent obtained through manipulation wasn't real consent, that selling access to your wife's body without her knowledge was a profound violation regardless of her physical response. I told him I wanted a divorce. He was shocked, saying I was overreacting to something that happened 20 years ago, that our marriage had survived this long and was stable and comfortable, that throwing it away over one night decades past was irrational. I said our marriage was built on his willingness to violate my autonomy for his entertainment and profit, that I'd spent 20 years not knowing something fundamental about myself and my sexual history, that I couldn't trust him or respect him knowing what he'd done. We separated within weeks. Adrian fought the divorce initially, but eventually accepted it when I made clear I had documentation from Marcus of the financial transaction and would share it publicly if necessary. The divorce finalized within a year. We had no children, had significant assets to divide, but managed it through mediation without court battles. I got half of everything we'd built over 20 years, moved into a downtown condo, and started rebuilding my life at 48 years old. But here's where the story gets complicated in ways I'm still processing. The divorce wasn't motivated purely by violation and betrayal, though those were real and valid. It was also motivated by something else, something harder to admit and harder to understand. That night 20 years ago, manufactured and manipulative as it had been, had shown me a part of myself I'd buried and forgotten. It had awakened desires and possibilities I'd never explored. And learning the truth about it made me realize I wanted to explore those parts of myself intentionally and authentically, rather than remaining in a marriage that had always been about Adrian's control and my compliance. The woman I'd been that night, desired, powerful, sexually confident, she'd been real even if the circumstances were fake, and I'd spent 20 years suppressing her, playing the role of Adrian's conventional wife while that other version of myself remained locked away. Learning the truth didn't just reveal Adrian's betrayal, it revealed my own suppression of desires and possibilities I'd never given myself permission to explore. After the divorce, I started therapy to process everything. My therapist helped me understand that my feelings were complicated and contradictory, and that was okay. I could be angry about the violation while also grateful for the awakening. I could condemn Adrian's manipulation while also appreciating that the experience had shown me something true about myself. Humans contain multitudes, and our responses to complicated situations don't have to be simple or singular. I also started cautiously exploring the sexual desires and curiosities that night had awakened. I dated different people, had experiences I'd never allowed myself during my marriage, discovered parts of my sexuality I'd never examined. I learned that I enjoyed being desired by multiple people, that I found power in sexual attention and exploration, that conventional monogamous relationship structures didn't fulfill me the way I'd always assumed they should. This self-discovery was liberating but also confusing and sometimes shameful. I'd been raised with conventional values about female sexuality and appropriate behavior. Admitting to myself that I enjoyed sexual experiences outside traditional norms required confronting internalized shame and judgment. My therapist helped me separate authentic desire from trauma response, helping me ensure I was exploring these aspects of myself from a place of genuine interest, rather than trying to reclaim power that had been taken from me. I reconnected with Marcus about a year after my divorce. I thanked him for telling me the truth, even though it had been 20 years late. We talked extensively about that night, about his role in it, about his motivations for finally revealing everything. He apologized repeatedly for participating in something that violated my consent, regardless of my enjoyment. We processed the complicated reality that he'd genuinely been attracted to me and had enjoyed our encounter while also knowing it was unethical given the hidden financial arrangement. Marcus and I eventually developed an unexpected friendship built on brutal honesty about that night and its aftermath. He was one of the few people I could talk to about the contradictory feelings I had about the experience, the violation and the awakening, the betrayal and the self-discovery. He understood the complexity because he'd been part of it and carried his own guilt and confusion about his participation. I'm now 50 years old, 2 years past my divorce, and living a life that looks nothing like the one I had with Adrian. I'm still working in marketing consulting, but on my own terms. I have a circle of friends who know my full story and accept me without judgment. I'm dating non-exclusively, exploring relationships and connections that fulfill different aspects of who I am. I'm discovering that I'm more complex and less conventional than I'd ever allowed myself to be during my marriage. What I want people to understand from my story is that sexual violation can coexist with authentic experience, that something can be both traumatic and transformative, that you can be angry about manipulation while also grateful for awakening. Adrian's betrayal was real and wrong and unforgivable, but the part of myself I discovered that night was also real and valid and worth exploring. Those two truths don't cancel each other out. I also want people to understand that consent is everything. The fact that I enjoyed an experience doesn't retroactively justify the deception and manipulation that created it. Adrian violated my autonomy regardless of my physical response. That violation is separate from whatever authentic self-discovery happened within the experience. Both things can be true simultaneously. The awakening I had wasn't worth the violation that enabled it. But given that the violation happened, I've chosen to take ownership of the awakening rather than remaining a victim of the violation. I've chosen to explore the desires and possibilities that night revealed rather than suppressing them out of shame about how I discovered them. I've chosen to build a life that honors the complexity of who I actually am rather than who I thought I should be. From the moment Marcus told me the truth, the rules of my life changed forever. Not because the truth destroyed me, but because it freed me to become someone I'd never allowed myself to be. The night Adrian sold me for $5,000 was meant to be his secret, his power, his control. Instead, it became my awakening, my liberation, my reclamation of agency and desire. I'm not grateful to Adrian for what he did, but I'm grateful for who I've become in response to learning the truth. Sometimes the worst betrayals crack us open in ways that let light in. Sometimes violations reveal truths about ourselves we'd never have discovered otherwise. Sometimes being sold teaches you that you're priceless. If this complicated, honest story resonated with you, if you've ever discovered something painful that also set you free, smash that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone navigating their own awakening. Comment below about a truth that changed your life. Remember that you're more complex than you've been allowed to be, that your desires are valid even when they're unconventional, and that reclaiming your story is always possible no matter how it began.